The fluorescent lights in Mercy General's cardiac wing flickered like dying stars as Elena Rodriguez hurried down the sterile corridor, her sneakers squeaking against the polished linoleum. Her double shift was already stretching into its 14th hour, but the emergency alarm that had just pierced the midnight silence meant sleep would have to wait even longer. Room 314 was in chaos when she arrived, machines beeping frantically as Dr. Patterson worked over an unconscious man whose expensive watch caught the harsh overhead light. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The patient had been rushed in 40 minutes earlier after collapsing at an exclusive downtown restaurant. Heart attack, massive and unforgiving. Now he lay unconscious, his gray hair disheveled, designer suit jacket cut away to reveal the leads and wires keeping him tethered to life. Elena had seen dozens of cases like this, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the way his hand still clutched a small photograph, or how even in unconsciousness, his face held a gentle expression that seemed out of place in the harsh reality of the ICU. Dr. Patterson looked up from the chart, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. The surgery was successful, but we need to keep him under observation for at least another week. Problem is, Elena, his insurance was denied. Some clause about a pre-existing condition they claim he didn't disclose. The family hasn't been contacted yet, and frankly, we're looking at a bill that could reach 6 figures. Elena's stomach dropped. She'd seen this scenario play out too many times before. Good people, caught in the bureaucratic maze of healthcare, losing everything they'd worked for because of one moment of medical crisis. She glanced at the man again, noting the calluses on his hands despite the expensive clothing. This wasn't some entitled executive who could write a check without blinking. This was someone who worked with his hands. Someone who probably saved every penny for years to afford that one nice suit. Without hesitation, Elena reached for her purse. She pulled out her credit card, the one she'd been saving to finally take her daughter Maria on that trip to Disney World they'd been planning for 3 years. Her voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. Put it on this. The entire bill. Dr. Patterson stared at her in disbelief. Elena, you can't possibly afford this. We're talking about over $80,000. You're a single mother working double shifts just to make ends meet. Elena looked at the sleeping man one more time, then back at the doctor. Some things are worth more than money, Dr. Patterson. This man has a family somewhere. They shouldn't lose him because of paperwork. 3 days passed before the man opened his eyes. Elena was checking his vitals when she saw his eyelids flutter, then slowly open to reveal warm brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He blinked several times, confusion clouding his features as he tried to speak through the oxygen mask. "Take it easy," Elena said softly, gently placing her hand on his arm. "You're in the hospital. You had a heart attack, but you're going to be okay." The man's eyes focused on her face, and she saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, though she was certain they'd never met. He gestured weakly toward the mask, and she carefully helped him remove it. His voice was hoarse, but clear. "You're the nurse who paid for my surgery." Elena felt her cheeks flush. She hadn't expected him to find out so soon. Word traveled fast in hospitals, especially when it involved something as unusual as a nurse covering a patient's entire bill. "I just did what anyone would do," she said quietly. The man struggled to sit up slightly, and Elena quickly adjusted his bed to make him more comfortable. He studied her face with an intensity that made her slightly uncomfortable. "What's your name?" "Elena Rodriguez." "Elena?" he repeated slowly, as if testing how the name felt. "I'm Thomas Whitfield, and I need you to know something. I'm not just anyone. I'm the founder and CEO of Whitfield Industries." Elena's breath caught. Whitfield Industries was one of the largest manufacturing companies in the state, employing thousands of people. She'd seen their name on everything from local charity events to the hospital's new children's wing. But this man lying in a hospital bed with his gentle eyes and work-worn hands didn't look like any CEO she'd ever imagined. Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. "But more importantly, I'm a father. And my daughter Sophie, she's 6 years old, and she's been through 3 nannies in the past 4 months. None of them understood her. She's special, brilliant, creative, but she sees the world differently than other children. When I collapsed at that restaurant, I was having dinner alone because I couldn't find anyone willing to stay late enough to watch her so I could attend a business function. He paused, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. You saved my life, Elena. But it's not just that. It's how you did it. Without question, without knowing who I was or whether you'd ever see that money again. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of person you are. Elena shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Whitfield, I appreciate your gratitude, but I have my own daughter to think about. I work here because I need the steady income and the benefits. Thomas nodded slowly. What if I told you I could offer you both? What if I asked you to come work for me as Sophie's nanny? Full salary, complete benefits, housing provided, and your daughter would be welcome. More than welcome. Sophie needs a friend her own age, and from what I've observed about you, I think Maria might be exactly what she needs. Elena's mind reeled. The offer was beyond generous, almost too good to be true. But there was something in Thomas's eyes, a desperation that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with a father's love for his child. I don't know anything about being a nanny to a CEO's daughter, Elena said slowly. Thomas smiled for the first time since he'd awakened. You know about being a mother. You know about sacrifice. You know about putting someone else's needs before your own. That's all Sophie needs. Someone who will see her for who she is, not who the world expects her to be. 2 weeks later, Elena found herself standing in front of a sprawling colonial house in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. The manicured lawn and perfectly trimmed hedges spoke of wealth beyond her imagination. But as she walked up the stone pathway with Maria's small hand in hers, she noticed something that made her smile. Chalk drawings covered the front porch, elaborate hopscotch grids and rainbow spirals that spoke of a child who was allowed to be creative, even in this perfect setting. Thomas answered the door himself, looking healthier than he had in the hospital but still moving carefully. His smile was genuine as he knelt down to Maria's level. You must be Maria. Sophie has been asking about you every day since I told her you were coming. Maria, normally shy around strangers, surprised Elena by stepping forward slightly. Is Sophie the one who drew the pictures on the porch? Because they're really good. Thomas's face lit up. She is. Would you like to meet her? He led them through a house that was elegant but clearly lived in. Family photos covered the mantel, and children's artwork was displayed proudly on the refrigerator. The living room had been partially converted into what looked like an art studio, with easels and craft supplies organized neatly on child-sized tables. Sophie appeared at the top of the grand staircase like something out of a fairy tale. She was small for 6, with dark curls that seemed to have a mind of their own and her father's warm brown eyes. But there was something else about her, an intensity in the way she observed everything around her, as if she were cataloging details that others might miss. She descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. When she reached the bottom, she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she walked directly to Maria and held out her hand. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Inside was a small origami crane, perfectly folded from bright yellow paper. I made this for you, Sophie said, her voice soft but clear. Daddy said, you like art too. Maria accepted the crane with reverence, turning it over in her small hands. It's beautiful. Can you teach me how to make one? Sophie's face transformed with the first genuine smile Elena had seen from her. Yes, I can teach you lots of things. Do you want to see my room? As the 2 girls headed upstairs, chattering excitedly, Thomas turned to Elena with tears in his eyes. She hasn't connected with anyone like that since her mother died 2 years ago. Elena felt her heart clench. She hadn't known Thomas was a widower, hadn't realized that this little girl had lost her mother so young. It explains so much about the careful way Sophie moved through the world, the intensity in her eyes that seemed too old for someone so small. The first few weeks in the Whitfield house passed like a dream Elena was afraid to wake from. Sophie was indeed special, but not in the way that required careful handling or professional intervention. She was simply a brilliant, sensitive child who had been misunderstood by adults who expected her to fit into conventional molds. Sophie loved routines but could adapt when necessary. She was particular about textures and sounds, but could communicate her needs clearly when adults bothered to listen. She was affectionate, but on her own terms, preferring gentle touches and quiet conversations to overwhelming displays of emotion. Most importantly, she and Maria became inseparable almost immediately. Maria, who had always been somewhat reserved due to their financial struggles and Elena's long work hours, blossomed under Sophie's attention. The two girls created elaborate art projects, built blanket forts that took over entire rooms, and developed their own language of inside jokes and shared secrets. Elena found herself settling into the rhythm of life in the Whitfield house more easily than she'd expected. Thomas was often away on business, but when he was home, he was completely present. He helped with homework, participated in art projects, and never missed bedtime stories. He was nothing like the absent, workaholic father she'd imagined when she first learned who he was. One evening, about a month after they'd moved in, Elena was cleaning up after dinner when she heard piano music drifting from the living room. She followed the sound and found Thomas at a beautiful grand piano she hadn't noticed before, his fingers moving effortlessly across the keys as he played a haunting melody. Sophie sat beside him on the bench, her small hands occasionally reaching out to press a key in harmony with his playing. Maria sat cross-legged on the floor, her chin resting on her hands as she listened with rapt attention. Elena stood in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt the moment. There was something peaceful about the scene, something that spoke of healing and family in ways that had nothing to do with money or status. Thomas noticed her eventually and smiled, his hands never pausing in their movement across the keys. "Sarah, my wife, she taught me to play." "Sophie's been learning too, haven't you, sweetheart?" Sophie nodded seriously. "Mommy said music is like feelings you can hear. When Daddy plays, I can feel that he misses her, but also that he's happy we're together." Elena felt tears spring to her eyes at the simple wisdom in the child's words. She thought about her own struggles as a single mother, about the loneliness she'd carried for so long, about the way this house had begun to feel like home in ways her small apartment never had. As the months passed, Elena began to notice changes in all of them. Sophie grew more confident, more willing to try new things and meet new people. Maria's grades improved dramatically, and her teacher commented on how much more engaged she seemed in class. Even Elena found herself laughing more, sleeping better, feeling like she was part of something larger than just survival. Thomas, too, seemed different. The stressed, worried man she'd met in the hospital had been replaced by someone who smiled more easily, who lingered over breakfast conversations, who made time for spontaneous dance parties in the kitchen when the girls' favorite songs came on the radio. One Saturday morning, Elena was surprised to find Thomas in the kitchen early, making pancakes from scratch while Sophie and Maria set the table with an elaborate arrangement of flowers they picked from the garden. "Special occasion?" Elena asked, accepting the cup of coffee he handed her. Thomas smiled mysteriously. "You could say that. I have some news to share, and I wanted to do it properly." After breakfast, with both girls sticky with syrup and giggling over shared jokes, Thomas cleared his throat. "Sophie, Maria, Elena, I have something to tell you. Yesterday I made a decision that I've been thinking about for months." He looked at each of them in turn, his expression serious but happy. "I've decided to step down as CEO of Whitfield Industries. I'm keeping my position on the board, but I'm handing over day-to-day operations to my business partner." Elena felt her stomach drop. Did this mean their arrangement was ending? Was he moving away? Selling the house? Thomas seemed to sense her panic because he quickly continued. "I realized that building a company was never the goal. The goal was building a life. And the life I want is here, with all of you. I want to be present for Sophie's childhood. I want to see Maria's art projects and help with homework. I want to have family dinners every night instead of business meetings." He turned to Elena specifically. "Most of all, I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll say yes." Elena's heart began to race. She couldn't quite believe what she thought she was hearing. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Elena Rodriguez, you saved my life in more ways than one. You brought joy back into this house. You gave Sophie the mother figure she needed and me the partner I never thought I'd find again. You turned a house into a home and a broken family into a whole one." He opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant ring, the diamond catching the morning sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows. "Will you marry me?" Will you let me spend the rest of my life showing you how grateful I am that you walked into our lives?" Elena felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked around the table. Sophie was bouncing in her seat with excitement, and Maria was grinning so widely it looked like her face might split in half. "Yes," Elena whispered, then louder, "Yes, of course, yes!" The engagement ring slipped onto her finger perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her hand. Thomas stood and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around while the girls cheered and clapped. As Elena looked around at her new family, she thought about that night in the hospital when she'd handed over her credit card without hesitation. She'd thought she was simply doing the right thing, helping a stranger in need. She never could have imagined that one act of kindness would lead to this moment, this life, this love. The wedding took place 6 months later in the garden behind their house. It was a small ceremony, just close friends and family, with Sophie and Maria serving as flower girls in matching dresses they'd helped design themselves. The girls had insisted on making their own bouquets from flowers they'd grown in the garden, and they walked down the aisle scattering petals and giggling with joy. Elena wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit her perfectly, with a veil that had been in her family for 3 generations. As she walked down the aisle to where Thomas waited, she thought about all the moments that had led to this one. The long shifts at the hospital, the financial struggles, the nights when she'd wondered if she was strong enough to keep going as a single mother. Thomas's eyes never left her face as she approached, and when the minister asked if he would take Elena to be his wife, his voice was strong and clear. "I will. I absolutely will." The reception was held under twinkling lights strung throughout the garden, with tables decorated by Sophie and Maria's artwork. Thomas's business partner gave a toast about how he'd never seen his friend happier, and Elena's supervisor from the hospital spoke about the kind of person who would sacrifice her own dreams to help a stranger. But the moment that made Elena cry was when Sophie stood up, her small voice carrying clearly through the garden as she read from a piece of paper she'd been clutching all evening. "Elena, before you came to live with us, Daddy and I were sad a lot. We missed Mommy, and our house was quiet, and sometimes I forgot how to smile. But you taught me that families can grow and change and still be full of love. You taught Daddy how to laugh again. And you gave me Maria, who was the best friend I ever had." Sophie paused, looking directly at Elena with those wise brown eyes. "Thank you for saving Daddy's life, but thank you more for saving our family." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden as Elena knelt down to hug Sophie, with Maria quickly joining the embrace. Thomas wrapped his arms around all 3 of them, and Elena realized that this was what happiness felt like. Not the fleeting joy of a moment, but the deep, abiding contentment of being exactly where you belonged. 2 years later, Elena stood in the same garden, this time watching Sophie and Maria, now 8 and 9, chase their baby brother around the playground Thomas had built in the far corner of the yard. Little David Thomas Whitfield had been born the previous spring, a surprise that had filled their already happy home with even more laughter and love. Lena's hand rested on her growing belly, where baby number 4 was making his or her presence known with increasingly strong kicks. She and Thomas had decided to wait to find out the gender, wanting to be surprised. Sophie was convinced it was a girl and had already started knitting a pink blanket. Maria was equally certain it was a boy and had begun work on a blue quilt. Thomas appeared beside her, sliding his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Whitfield." Elena leaned back against his chest, watching their children play in the golden light of late afternoon. "I was just thinking about that night at the hospital, how I thought I was just helping a stranger pay his medical bills. I never imagined it would lead to all this." Thomas's arms tightened around her. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been working that night, if Dr. Patterson had been assigned to a different nurse, if you'd made a different choice." Elena turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. "We found each other, Thomas. However it happened, whatever brought us together, we found each other, and we built something beautiful." Behind them, Sophie called out, "Mama Elena, come help us catch David. He's too fast!" Elena laughed, the sound carrying across the garden like music. "I'll be right there!" As she walked toward the children, Thomas caught her hand. "Elena," he said softly. She turned back to him, eyebrows raised in question. "Thank you. For everything. For saving my life. For loving my daughter. For giving me a family I never thought I'd have again." Thank you for showing me that the best investments aren't made with money, but with love. Elena smiled, the same smile that had made him fall in love with her in a hospital room 2.5 years earlier. Thank you for letting me. She squeezed his hand once, then hurried after the children, her laughter mixing with theirs as they tumbled together on the soft grass. Thomas watched them for a long moment, thinking about the night he'd collapsed in that restaurant, alone and overworked, and convinced that success meant sacrificing everything else. He thought about Elena's hands as she'd covered his medical bills, steady and sure despite the magnitude of what she was giving up. He thought about the first time Sophie had smiled at Maria, the first time he'd heard Elena humming while she cooked dinner, the first time he'd realized he was in love with the woman who'd saved his life in every way that mattered. As the sun set behind the trees, painting the garden in shades of gold and pink, Thomas joined his family on the grass. David immediately climbed into his lap, babbling happily in the language only babies understand. Sophie and Maria settled on either side of him, and Elena curled up against his free side, her head on his shoulder. "This is perfect," Sophie announced with the authority of an 8-year-old who had found her place in the world. "Yes," Elena agreed softly, her hand finding Thomas's free one and intertwining their fingers. "It really is." They sat together as the stars began to appear overhead, a family that had been born from kindness, nurtured by love, and strengthened by the understanding that the most valuable things in life could never be bought, only given freely from one heart to another. In the years that followed, Elena often thought about that moment of decision in the hospital, when she'd handed over her credit card without knowing how she'd pay the bills that month. It had seemed like such a small thing at the time, just doing what felt right in the moment. But it had changed everything, not just for Thomas, but for all of them. Sophie grew up to become a renowned artist, her childhood love of origami and chalk drawings evolving into sculptures that were displayed in galleries around the world. Maria followed in Elena's footsteps, becoming a nurse herself, specializing in pediatric care. She often said that watching Elena care for others had taught her that healing was about more than medicine. It was about seeing people as human beings worthy of love and respect. David and his younger sister Emma, the baby Elena had been carrying that day in the garden, both went into the family business, but with a difference. Under their leadership, Whitfield Industries became known not just for its products, but for its humanitarian efforts. They built hospitals in underserved communities, funded scholarships for children from low-income families, and created programs that provided healthcare and education to those who needed it most. Thomas often said that Elena had taught him the difference between success and significance. Success was about accumulating wealth and power. Significance was about using whatever resources you had to make the world a better place for others. Elena never returned to working double shifts in a hospital, but she never stopped being a nurse. She volunteered at free clinics, mentored young nurses just starting their careers, and served on the board of several charitable organizations. Most importantly, she continued to see the world through the eyes of someone who understood that healing happened one person at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one moment of choosing to put someone else's needs before your own. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Elena with a scholarship fund established in her name at the nursing school where she'd trained. The Elena Rodriguez Whitfield Scholarship would provide full tuition and living expenses for single mothers pursuing nursing degrees, ensuring that other women like Elena would have the chance to build careers that allowed them to care for their families while serving others. As Elena read the plaque that would hang in the nursing school lobby, tears streamed down her cheeks. Thomas had captured perfectly the spirit of what she'd always believed about nursing, about motherhood, about life itself. The inscription read, quote, "In honor of Elena Rodriguez Whitfield, who understood that the greatest strength lies not in what we can take, but in what we choose to give." That evening, as they celebrated with their children and grandchildren, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with a single decision made in a moment of crisis, a choice to help a stranger despite the cost to herself. But it had become so much more than that. It had become a legacy of love, a testament to the idea that kindness was never wasted, that generosity always found its way back to the giver in ways they could never imagine. As the family gathered around the piano for their traditional anniversary song, Elena looked around at the faces she loved most in the world. Sophie, now a mother herself, held her toddler son while he clapped along to the music. Maria sang harmony with her own children, their voices blending beautifully with the melody. David and Emma flanked their father at the piano, their faces glowing with pride and happiness. This was what Elena's choice had created. Not just a family, but a legacy of love that would continue long after she was gone. Every act of kindness her children performed, every life they touched, every moment they chose compassion over convenience, would be a continuation of the story that had begun in a hospital room on a stormy night. As Thomas played the final notes of their song, Elena closed her eyes and sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. She had set out to save one life, and in doing so, she had found her own. She had given freely of what little she had, and in return, she had received more than she ever could have dreamed. The music faded, but the love remained, filling the room like warm light, a reminder that the best stories were never about what we accumulated, but about what we gave away, and how those gifts transformed not just the lives of others, but our own lives as well. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.